Polish police kill a solidarity demonstrator in violent street battles in Krakow. But the union vows its voice will not be stilled. This is O28 News. Good evening. Australia's Foreign Minister begins efforts to get Moscow back to the arms negotiating table, but the prospects remain dim. Details soon on O28 News. Good evening. More US backing for the Gulf oil states. More tankers bank up at the entrance to the vital waterway.
American hostages still held in Lebanon as on-again, off-again released plans delay their trip to freedom. This is SBS World News. Good evening and welcome to our new viewers in Brisbane, Adelaide, the Gold Coast, Newcastle and Wollongong, joining for the first time our network audience in Melbourne, Sydney and Canberra.
A bloody end to a demonstration by peasant farmers in Manila. This is SBS World News. Good evening. Police and troops in Manila are tonight on full alert after a demonstration outside the presidential palace ended in bloodshed with soldiers firing into the crowd.
Anger over Victoria's building society crisis. And a homecoming turns violent in South Africa. This is SBS World News. Good evening. The Soviet Union has lifted its crippling economic blockade of Lithuania 24 hours after the rebel republic agreed to freeze its declaration of independence.
Growing world pressure for an end to the war that turns children into soldiers. The death of a giant of German politics. And the rising damages bill in South Australia's flooding.
All-out effort to complete key bridge for Bosnian NATO mission. Italian Prime Minister set to resign, and Yeltsin adamant on reform despite election woes.
And flood as the world goes through its hottest month on record. Australian held by military regime in Burma and famous soccer club gets its own TV channel. Good evening, I'm Indira Naidu. Submarine drama, Russia turns to NATO for help. Supersonic setback, Britain grounds its fleet of Concords. Shootout in the West Bank as Middle East peace talks resume. And Clinton hands the baton to Gore. Good evening, I'm Indira Naidu.
Taking flight, Argentina's president flees the palace as crowds bay for his blood outside. British troops arrive in Afghanistan ahead of tomorrow's swearing-in of the new government. The Commonwealth takes a step towards expelling Zimbabwe. The Prime Minister comes to the defence of the Governor-General. And Moscow gives the Salvation Army their marching orders. Good evening, Anton Enos with SBS World News Tonight. Fraught visit. Australian bomb victim puts the Prime Minister on the spot in London. Not welcome. Britain draws up plans to deport alleged extremists. Don't panic. The message from Australia's medical chief as bird flu spreads to Indonesia. And saying sorry. Steve Vizard appears in court. Good evening, Anton Enos with World News Australia. To those stories in a moment, but first to some breaking news in Indonesia.
The federal government changes tack on carbon emissions trading.
American and Iraqi forces set for the mother of all battles in Baghdad.
And the fact that the day after we had spent 4 days with him, charges are presented to him in our absence. An act of bastardry on any scale.
An angry lawyer for David Hicks arrives back from Guantanamo Bay.
And a question for the Qantas consortium, will it still call Australia home? Good evening and welcome to SBS World News Australia. I'm Mary Kostakidis.
And I'm Stan Grant. Also tonight.
I shift from second into fifth gear and the fuel consumption drops significantly.
How changing your driving habits can cut emissions and save money.
And in sport, a new coach appointed for the Australian cricket team. But first tonight, the federal government has been persuaded to consider a national trading scheme on carbon emissions as part of its response to climate change. The opposition says it's about time. But the Prime Minister says he won't be endorsing anything that hurts Australian industry, including a carbon tax.
Two Australians among more than 60 people killed in a Cuban air crash.
There was some engine trouble and deja vu.
Qantas defends safety record as passengers experience another mid-air emergency over Singapore. Militants kill scores in Pakistan mosque bombings and the Taliban talks.
And Australia wins gold at the World Rowing Championships in New Zealand.
Good evening and welcome to SBS World News Australia. I'm Lee Lin Chin.
And I'm Michael Tomalaris.
Flood levies hold, but Queensland towns are not out of the danger zone yet.
I am very confident that we will hold the water out of the majority of the town that's inside that levee bank.
Preferred Prime Minister Julia Gillard overtakes Tony Abbott in the polls but still lags behind Kevin Rudd.
If we do that hard work, I believe we can win the election when it's held in 2013.
Dozens killed in Syrian shelling amid anger over UN veto.
From SBS, this is World News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to SBS World News Australia. I'm Anton Enos.
And I'm Janice Peterson.
Touring the drought zone, Tony Abbott promises aid for struggling farmers.
It's really analogous to a natural disaster.
Failure in Geneva, talks on Syria and in impasse.
I'm very, very sorry, and I apologize to the Syrian people.
And battered Britain cleans up after the latest Atlantic gale.
This is SBS World News with Lee Lin Chin.
The federal government has promised an assistance package for drought-hit farmers, having recently rejected support for Holden and SPC at Mona. Prime Minister Tony Abbott says drought support is more like disaster relief than industry assistance. Today he toured Western New South Wales and Longreach in Queensland. The heavens opened for his visit. Coming up, the weather, and the golden bag goes to... The Berlin Film Festival salutes international movies. Bracing for impact. Deadly Hurricane Irma about to make landfall in Florida. Fighting for a bag of rice, the desperate plight of Rohingya refugees. And a North Korean defector story, a special report from Seoul.
This is SBS World News with Lee Lin Chin.
Good evening. Florida is bracing tonight for the force of Hurricane Irma, potentially the worst storm in the state's history. Coming up after the break, thousands march in support of same-sex marriage. Shortly, buried treasure found alongside new mummies in Egypt. And later, uncovering ancient mysteries in South Australia. With just days to the mail-out of the same-sex marriage postal survey, the nation's political leaders have called on Australians to say yes. As thousands of supporters rallied in Sydney and Brisbane, the Prime Minister said if that is the outcome, same-sex marriage could be law by the end of the year.
Good evening, I'm Darren Mara. The top stories. South Korea steps up defence preparations after warning Pyongyang may launch an ICBM into the Pacific. Race for Chancellor Angela Merkel firms as Germany's favourite after a televised debate. And a fair dinkum Aussie, Bill Shorten, puts forward proof he's eligible to sit in Parliament. Tensions on the North Korean peninsula are deepening tonight, with South Korea warning that Pyongyang may launch an... Well, coming up after the break, Barack Obama's advice to Donald Trump, the leaked letter to the president. Soldiers in Myanmar are denying fresh allegations of murder, rape and arson against members of the minority Rohingya Muslim community.
Thousands flee their homes in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Mangkhut approaches. Downgraded but still deadly, Hurricane Florence starts lashing the US East Coast.
This is a powerful storm that can kill. Today, the threat becomes a reality.
And Russian suspects in the poisoning of a former spy claim their innocence, saying they were just tourists.
This is SBS World News with Michael Tomalaris.
Good evening. A super typhoon is just hours away from smashing into the Philippines, threatening millions of people.
Senior US troops arrive in Europe, but as NATO bolsters its eastern flank, Russia continues to show off its military might.
Black lives they matter again.
Hundreds take to the streets in Minneapolis, angered over the fatal police shooting of a young black man. Homes destroyed as catastrophic conditions fuel multiple fires in Western Australia. And the Prime Minister says he's forgiven Barnaby Joyce over an exchange of scathing text messages.
This is SBS World News with Janice Peterson.
Good evening. The first of nearly 3,000 US troops have landed in Europe as NATO moves to bolster its eastern flank over the escalating Ukraine crisis.